Good morning, everyone, out there in TV land and YouTube land. So, I actually was rocking on Friday on transforming viruses and the idea about how viruses can bring on the transformed state. And there actually was an article in like Science News or something. Heck, I probably should send it up to you. That is about HPV, human papillomavirus. It may have been from somebody in Cold Spring Harbor. And its relationship to cervical cancer. And it's a pretty serious relationship. It's not a guarantee, but it is a significant factor. Like, I don't know, 70% of cervical cancers are associated with HPV infection, which is why there is, in fact, now Gardasil, which is a vaccine against human papillomavirus. And it is, young women are encouraged to take it, and young gentlemen are encouraged to take it. Young men, because that it would be one of the ways you would spread it. And also there is a slight chance of various sort of urogenital cancers in young men. What creeps me out is that, they're saying that when young women are 11 years old, they should start, they should have Gardasil. I'm like, damn, man, really? Because it is primarily a sexually transmitted disease. And then thinking, oh, shit, like whatever. It made me kind of creeped out to think about it. And I don't know if my child is vaccinated against HPV. I'm not, but...
I didn't get it until I was 19.
Yeah, well, I mean, it is a thing we probably should, as a public health notion, we should be doing. Because it does dramatically reduce the risk of cervical cancer. And so that's something to think about. At the same time, it's close, but it's not as nasty as a range of viruses like Ralph sarcoma virus. In chickens, it can cause muscle issues. You have a whole bunch of things in cats. There are a variety of different organisms, and there are, in fact, primate transforming retroviruses. And so we talked a little bit about this, that retroviruses over the history, the sort of evolutionary history of the virus, land near a gene that's responsible for controlling the cell cycle. One of these signaling proteins. We'll be getting into this in Blood and Cell in a couple of weeks. One of my favorite topics. And when they pull themselves back out, they grab a portion of this gene. And they don't have the entire piece. They've got a chunk of it. Maybe a portion that's adding phosphates to something, or a portion that's not being well regulated, but is actually able to carry out the signaling process. And so you now have this very potent signaling protein under essentially no control. When it lands in a cell, it starts saying, hey, everybody, let's start dividing. And that is what generates the transformed state. So this is the genome of the Ralph sarcoma virus. We've got the GAG, PAL, and ONV genes on the RNA. The RNA comes in, it gets transcribed back into DNA, and that is the responsibility of one of the proteins here. So this thing, when it gets into the cell, just like the RNA uptake of the Moderna and Pfizer vaccine, the RNA itself is translated. The protein that it produces actually cleaves itself up. It has to have a protease that is part of it that kind of bites itself and chops it into a few smaller proteins. One of those proteins is the reverse transcriptase that goes from RNA back to DNA, and then it also produces the envelope and coat proteins, and it's able to package itself back up, or it's able to turn its DNA or its RNA into a DNA, integrate into the genome, and actually be a viral lysogen and be latent. So it is an interesting kind of mechanism. And this is some percentages, and happily, they're fairly low. Let's see, do we have HPV? Yeah, HPV now is something like 70%. It's actually a lot higher now. So hepatitis has a liver-associated cancer. The HTLV is associated, although very rarely, with leukemias. HPV, I think the really number is a lot higher now. Kaposi sarcoma has been primarily associated with HIV, but there is a herpes virus that's associated with it. Epstein-Barr is a pretty common virus, and it is occasionally associated with different kinds of lymphomas and blood cell diseases. So we don't have a solid sort of you catch it, you get it kind of phenomenon. I have to actually look up human papillomavirus. I thought it was something like 70%, but it may not be that high. All right, here's another actually interesting story that gets thrown in when people start talking about viruses. And it is the causative agent of mad cow disease. And I think that, at least in the book puts it in here as well, back in the day, so this would be like, early 80s, I took a class in plant pathology and plant diseases. And they categorized disease-causing agents as being either bacterial, fungal, viral, and within viral diseases, I mean, there are things like tobacco mosaic virus, which we actually looked at. There was a category that was known as slow viruses. And these viruses would take like years to manifest themselves, but epidemiologists would be able to collect a group of people and say, okay, you guys have this, and start tracking it back. That they were all, there was an outbreak in like 94 in the UK, 95, but they tracked it back to kids in a third grade elementary school eating a school lunch, and they all got the human equivalent of mad cow disease, Creutzfeldt-Jakob. So it takes a long time, sometimes up to 15 years, to see the disease manifest itself in humans. And so it was known as a slow virus. For a long time, then, up until really the late 80s, early 90s, people were looking for the virus that caused mad cow disease. And they would take homogenates of brain, and part of what happens is that you have sheep that develop a disease known as scrapie, and it has been around since people have been domesticating sheep. There is a disease in cows known as mad cow disease, and the cows begin to act drunk and they fall over. There is a similar kind of disease in humans that is known as Creutzfeldt-Jakob, and it had been initially discovered in Papua New Guinea, a disease that the New Guineans called Kuru, and it was a tribe of cannibals. And it turned out that the women tended to be afflicted with it because during their ritual consumption of their dead elders, the women were given the soft tissue, like the brain and spine, and the men would take the heart and muscle. And this is known as transmissible spongiform encephalopathy. So you can see how you start to get these big dark patches and essentially Swiss cheese brain. It takes a while, but it absolutely is a complete neurodegenerative disease that is totally incurable. So it took quite some time to begin linking all these different diseases as the same kind of phenomenon. They all exhibit bovine spongiform encephalopathy, or whatever sheep are. And so people were looking for a virus. The human disease, it began to be figured out in cannibals and things. So there you go. Smart cannibals don't eat brains, which is always my motto, is that ritualistic cannibalism, I got no problem with it, just don't eat the brain. It turns out that rather than having an actual virus, because, guys have been grinding up brain homogenate and demonstrating that brain homogenate could actually be used as an infectious agent. That is, you take a sick sheep, grind up his brain, and inject it or feed it to another organism. And in fact, there's trans-species infection. And this guy that I saw a seminar with was working with guinea pigs, and they would take sheep homogenate, give it to the guinea pigs, maybe injecting them, regardless. They would assess the guinea pigs for mad guinea pig disease by going into the animal room, and the guinea pigs would all come up to the cage, and if you took a pencil and booped them on the nose, the guinea pigs that were infected would back off and go into the corner. But non-affected guinea pigs would lean forward and want to play. So they had their nose boop assay, and they could infect guinea pigs. And they began looking and comparing the infected guinea pig versus the non-infected guinea pig, looking for the virus. And you do this the same way that all these different epidemiologists have been doing it forever, of taking fractions and seeing, can you find a viral RNA? Can you find viral DNA? There's no evidence of bacteria. What the heck is this? And it wasn't until the mid-90s that a guy named Prusiner, who ended up winning the Nobel Prize, actually discovered this notion of the prion. I mean, the virus had been called a prion. I'm not even sure what the etiology of that word is from a long time, but this was the slow virus. Turns out it is not a virus at all. It is a malformed, misshapen protein. And the protein actually goes from a normal protein shape into an abnormal protein shape. And this is the first example of a protein shape change that results in a disease. Actually, that's not probably the main point. But a protein shape change that is transmissible, in that you can have wild-type normal protein shape and protein that has undergone this change in shape and is misshapen. If they touch, the normal protein will become misshapen. And so it doesn't even have to do anything with change of amino acid. I mean, it really is changing the way we think about the protein function. It is the protein's secondary and tertiary shape that has changed, and that change is actually transmissible. And there are some folks that have an amino acid change in their prion protein that makes it more likely it'll misfold, and that's how you get familial Creutzfeldt-Jakob. But for the rest of us, if you're exposed to the malformed protein, you can very slowly begin shifting all of your normal proteins, and they're found in the brain, into this malformed shape. And it begins to form plaques that then begin to degrade and start to generate holes. Turns out that this kind of system is actually part of what causes Alzheimer's as well. Alzheimer's is not transmissible, but Alzheimer's results in the malforming, the misshapen aspect of a protein called tau in the brain. It falls out of solution, it no longer functions, and you start to have Alzheimer's and dementia. And so this was truly Nobel Prize winning work, because it was recognizing that a shape change of a protein, A, is leading to the disease, and B, is in fact transmissible and not an external virus. That is a fairly weird kind of system in the body. All right, so that is our discussion of viruses per se. Let's get into some diseases of viruses. And just in the same way that we broke down bacteria by mode of entry, we're going to do the same thing with viruses. So respiratory and dermal virus diseases is where we're going to start with, and we'll just work our way through. So there are a range of common respiratory viruses. And these days, if I were to ask you to throw one out, I bet a lot of us would say either the flu, pneumonia, or COVID-19. This is the point. When we talk pneumonia, there is the standard pneumococcal bacteria that cause bacterial pneumonia, but then there's also viruses that can cause viral pneumonia, essentially fluid filling up in the lungs. So a very common virus involved in respiratory diseases is the influenza virus. And influenza is an RNA-based virus, and it's got a coat around it. It actually is completely enveloped. It is not a naked virus. And
this building is going to be home to all of the science-related classes. So if one of those disciplines that I mentioned, biology or physics or something like that is what you're interested in.
The virus changes quite frequently. Every year there are slightly different strains of the virus. And that's why we don't yet have, and probably never will, a universal flu virus vaccine. It just changes enough that you can't get a really good vaccine on it. All right, so the virus is binding to a receptor, and it then is brought into the cell through endocytosis. It's in a vesicle, and then the viral RNA is making its way into the cytoplasm, and it's replicated. It is turned into protein. It then can be packaged back up and released. So this is the standard kind of viral life cycle. And what you end up with is a protein that's got, or a cell that has viral proteins stuck on its surface. And so that's one of the ways the immune system is able to recognize this. Now, again, when we talk about flu and viruses in general, the spot where, or the disease manifestation has to do with the cell type that is picking up that cell, or picking up that virus. And so flu virus is specific for the upper respiratory tract. It doesn't get into the blood or the kidneys or the liver. It's not that kind of virus. Like hepatitis is a virus that binds very much into the liver, which is why you have hepatic issues with hepatitis virus. So the flu is a fairly significant kind of disease pathology. The key difference that I think is important to think about the flu versus something like COVID-19 is that the flu mortality is around 0.1%. The mortality rate for COVID was somewhere between 0.6 to 0.8%. So not quite 10 times, but a lot more lethal. And that's a big, big difference. The flu does kill people, absolutely. Between 25 to 50,000 people every year do die of the flu, as opposed to the over 500,000 people that have died from COVID-19 in the same year. So it's not fair to say that COVID-19 is just a strong flu. It is a different beast altogether. Flu variants change from year to year, and that can affect how severe the disease is going to manifest itself. And so pandemics do occur. And my grandmother used to talk about the 1918 flu pandemic, and it killed a lot of people. So then, these different flus at different places have different levels of lethality. And so, let's see, it probably was, in 2009, the flu variant known as H1N1 was around. And there actually was discussion at the very beginning of the semester that we were told, okay, you need to at least plan or be thinking about the fact that we're not going to come back to class after Thanksgiving. Because if H1N1 was as severe and did spread as much as it was feared that it might, that would be the beginning of a pandemic. As it turns out, H1N1 is not that lethal. And that may have done actually a disservice, and there was sort of people heard about, knew of H1N1 and the potential for pandemic, and nothing ever happened. And so a little bit of like, the sky is falling, and it never did. And then when COVID comes along, people aren't taking it very seriously. But the flu does absolutely kill folks. So we have the pandemic, and then the rate of death declines over the years. And this is actually, the standard kind of progress that we see in a variety of different kinds of pandemics. So the genetic variety in influenza is important. And this notion of what's called antigenic drift, which has to do with the term antigen, which is what antibodies bind to and the immune system recognizes, can begin to change. And so you have very minor changes in the coat protein that's sticking out of the virus. And this shift is what causes the different varieties and different strains of flu every year. And it just depends on if a genetic variety is more infectious. That one starts to get to be more in the population. If it's less infectious, it's not going to be as big a deal. The CDC and the World Health Organization, they began monitoring flu cases very early in the year, back in August when flu first was coming out in Asia and different parts of the world, determining what the strain is, and that's how they began making their best guess as to the flu vaccine. And the flu vaccine is typically made up using multiple antigens, like 2 or 3 different antigen variants. And when they hit it right, it can be 60% effective. If they don't hit it all that well, it's not all that effective. And actually, I was on the radio Thursday with my friends Scott and Jamie. Jamie's a physician's assistant, and I was making the comment that, I've never had a flu vaccine. And Scott looked at me and says, "You should get one." I went, I don't know. And so my point was, if they gave me a Starbucks coffee, I'd do it. And apparently they actually have set up the flu vaccination clinic over in the UC. And I'm like, sure. If it was being set up and delivered by nursing students, I'd go do it. Why not? So antivirals are around. And as we've been mentioning, antibiotics don't work against viruses, okay? Hopefully we all know this. I mean, it's sort of the standard story that if you go in with a cold, there's a virally induced cold, there ain't no reason to give you antibiotics. I mean, a secondary infection can come along, bacterial, but the primary viral infection, nope. So there are some antivirals. They are doing things that will interrupt the life cycle of the virus. Unlike antibiotics, which are killing the bacteria specifically by interacting with the bacterial's ability to replicate by itself, these are having to interact with the cellular mechanisms that are the virus is exploiting. And so there are a range of different kinds of antivirals, things that will block the release of the virus from the vesicle once it gets into the cell, the endosome unpacking and uncoating. You can block that. Amantadine, which actually I think was being used with COVID. Tamiflu, which is blocking the release from the cell. And in my own personal experience, Tamiflu didn't do jack. I think we mentioned this, that Tamiflu got kind of hauled up in the court for making some claims that were really not quite accurate. It is essentially limiting the amount of time that you have virus in the system, but it doesn't actually block flu symptoms entirely. There's a couple of other guys that are blocking RNA synthesis, but they are all moderately effective, but not like antibiotics are. Another virus that we know of is a collection of rhinoviruses. And these are the viruses that cause the common cold. So there are between 100 and 150 different rhinoviruses, viruses that cause the common cold. And with the other viruses around, some of them being coronaviruses, you probably can have about 200 different colds that you could get in a lifetime. I often think that if you live in a small town and you don't have a lot of people coming in and out, there's about 100 colds or so you're going to get. You get them, and you're more or less immune to them. You're never going to get colds anymore. You may have observed that as you get older, you get less colds. Because if you've had little babies, babies get colds all the time. In fact, they're kind of like one constant sniffling, draining mess for years. Because they have not been exposed to any of these viruses, and so they're just going to town with it. As you get older, you've been exposed to more and more viruses, and consequently, you have immunity against them. So the receptor is binding epithelial cells in the lung, and the viral RNA gets into the cell, it's replicated, and we then begin to, it produces its own protein coats, it packages itself up, and then is released back out into the environment. And you can exhale it and cough. So, we've all had colds. Primarily upper respiratory, not going to be getting too deep into the lungs. And so you have a very mild immune response to it. So, adenoviruses are another kind of cold virus. And these are just a different viral mechanism. It actually ends up being a DNA-based virus, not an RNA-based virus. The RNA is, or the DNA is getting into the nucleus, and from there it's being turned into RNA, goes back out into the cell, and is now turned into protein. And it's just one of the differences is RNA viruses have the potential of actually being an RNA that can be translated directly once it gets to the cell. The DNA virus, you actually have to get into the nucleus, get turned into RNA, and back out. So you can get adenoviruses, and then along with coronaviruses, or rhinoviruses, these are what typically cause the common cold. You can get slightly more symptoms with these. If you're not careful, it can progress to pneumonia. And, we do have places where this will actually start really moving through. There are some viruses that do have an oncogene in them. As a gene therapy vector, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is using a modified adenovirus. So what they have done is taken a portion of the COVID genome, put it into the adenovirus genome, and the adenovirus that they're using is defective in its ability to replicate. So you're not going to be coughing this thing out and sneezing it out. And you inject it, you're essentially giving somebody a viral infection. They must have it set up as well in that the receptor is binding to a different thing in a cell, a different cell type, probably to something in the red blood cells, or in the serum. And so it's not having to go into the lungs. And you begin to make the protein, and you generate immunity. So you can do all kinds of interesting genetic, manipulation with these different viruses as delivery systems. So this is one not as common. The respiratory syncytial virus. It is a kind of virus that's known as a paramyxovirus. It is a single-stranded RNA virus and very similar to flu. It's related to mumps and measles. You get immunity, but it's not just because of the way the virus is, you don't hold on to it very well. You have, fairly mild symptoms. Main concern, of course, is in little babies and in the elderly. The bronchi get inflamed, mucus begins to accumulate, the bronchi begin to swell up, and you start to have some breathing difficulties. This is where bronchial dilators come into play. Here is something that people, if you're listening to the coronavirus stories, talking about SARS. In fact, the COVID-19 virus is known as the SARS-CoV-19. So SARS stands for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome, which is how it was first identified. And COVID-19 also generates this. So you end up having a lot of deeper tissue getting infected. You start to have initially high fever, muscle aches, sort of a standard kind of influenza thing, primarily from the immune response, and so the vaccine can do the same thing to you. Then you start to get some of the symptoms because of the cells it's infecting, things like the dry cough, and then just essentially other kinds of immune response things. And over time, you might have breathing difficulties and the development of pneumonia, and then the pneumonia begins to have issues with the lung ability to actually do oxygen exchange. Lungs fill up with fluid, and this can result in death. So this is essentially what COVID-19 is doing. And COVID is a form of the severe acute respiratory syndrome that it was first discovered in '02. It didn't, just because of its infection rate, never really took off the way COVID did. And I'm sure, I know the genomes are sequenced, and it has to do, I would imagine, with its transmissibility. It just isn't transmitted nearly as well as COVID is. So the origin is similar to the way COVID-19 comes about, from a zoonotic, or a species transfer, bats to little raccoony civets to people. So, there are a lot of other coronaviruses in bat populations, and this is something that epidemiologists say does happen, and it's not really an if it will happen, it's more of a when it will happen, and pandemics do happen. And so while we're going to get beyond this one, it's not beyond the pale that within your lifetime, my lifetime, we might see another one. Hopefully, we're better prepared to recognize what's going on and take steps a lot faster. There are things that could have been done back in January when it became clear that this virus was transmitting a lot faster than SARS did, to set things up a little bit better. Because SARS spread, but not nearly as well as COVID does. So it again did start in China. There are a lot of bats there, and a lot of people. And so that's part of how this actually starts to happen. All right, let's go through just a few of some skin-related viruses, some you may be familiar with. So there are a class of viruses that are typically known as herpes viruses. And these cause everything from cold sores, what is known as herpes simplex 1 or HHV1, to things like chickenpox and shingles. And so the herpes virus is a non-naked, completely encapsulated virus. It's got its genome deep in there, and then a series of glycoprotein complexes. And depending on the type of herpes virus, it can cause a common cold sore. It can cause chickenpox that then, as the virus lysogenizes or integrates into the genome, primarily of the nervous system, which is where it binds, it can come out later, particularly in people that have been immunocompromised, and the flu could do that to you. So it's not uncommon as you get older, you get the flu, and then to add insult to injury, you get shingles on top of that, which results in a very painful rash that is typically asymmetric. It's going to be on one side of the face or the body because it is affecting the neurons that are not on both sides, but one side of them. Kaposi sarcoma is a cancer that is related to the herpes virus. Kaposi sarcoma is these brown patches on the skin. It is a standard dermal type virus. And we get exposed to Kaposi sarcoma probably, fairly frequently. A normal, healthy immune system is completely able to knock it out, and it doesn't get very far. When HIV first hit the scene, the way it was recognized was a cancer that the CDC had only seen like 3 times in its history began popping up much more frequently in members of the gay population, like in San Francisco. And this is how, first off, as the virus that causes AIDS begins to affect the immune system, the inability of your immune system to respond to specific viruses manifests itself as seeing this kind of cancer. So our immune system, and a healthy immune system, is pretty much the number one way to get rid of viruses. So just some of these you've heard of, a lot of herpes type viruses around. So we've got the oral herpes, genital herpes. Associated with this is chickenpox or shingles. Then there is a lot of mononucleosis, is both from the beta herpes virus or the gamma herpes virus, which not important that you memorize that, but it is slight differences in the genome, but they are herpes viruses. And this is also responsible, this type of virus is responsible for AIDS and lots of viral pneumonia. There's a disease known as Sick's disease. It's also manifests itself as roseola, and rosacea is a little bit different, but it is reddening of the skin, and rash, and a fever. There are a number of other herpes viruses that don't seem to have any specific disease they cause. Other viruses, Epstein-Barr virus is the primary virus for mononucleosis. It also causes or associated with a couple of other lymphomas and things. And then we have Kaposi's. Let's see. Chronic fatigue syndrome has been associated with Epstein-Barr virus. So they can do a variety of different things. All right. We will stop here and pick up on Wednesday. We're going to start the plan is to start our unknown